Ecclesiastes was not written for Twitter. Let's get into God's Word. We are calling this week Conclusion Part 1. We're calling it Conclusion Part 1 because you cannot conclude this book without understanding the author a little bit, and the author even knows that. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the conclusion of the matter, or the end of the book, starts this way in verse 8. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher. Completely meaningless. Imagine tweeting that. This is the Bible. This is God's Word. Everything's meaningless. It doesn't make sense out of context. There are a ton of verses all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes that if you cherry pick them, they're not very awesome. At one point, the author, Solomon, says, "So I hated life." At one point, he's telling everybody, hey, just eat, drink, be merry. At one point, he says, enjoy the wife of your youth. If you take that out of the context, it indicates that, hey, everybody just needs to get married. These things aren't necessarily true, are they? Let's read on. He says, verse 9, "Keep this in mind. The teacher was considered wise, and he taught the people everything he knew. He listened carefully to many proverbs, studying and classifying them." Verse 10, "The teacher sought to find just the right words to express the truths clearly." That's the only verses we're going to focus on today because, like I said, it is incredibly important to really understand the book of Ecclesiastes. It's one book. And you have to look at it as one book, a complete idea. It's only 12 chapters. You can literally read it in just a little while. It does not take long to read through the book of Ecclesiastes. What we've done is we've unpacked it week by week, a few verses at a time, and we've talked about things. Every now and then I've referenced Solomon's life or that the wisdom literatures, this is 3,000 years old, and I've talked about a few things with Solomon. But here's an interesting thing. If you look at the book of Ecclesiastes as a complete book, it falls in a large collection of books that we call the Bible, right? So this is one book in the Bible. You have to look at the book individually, by itself, to get some understanding and meaning. But then you also have to look at it historically. You have to look at it in light of what happened 1,000 years later, Jesus being born. You have to look at it in light of everything that changed under the new covenant. And then you have to seriously take a look at the conclusion, which we're going to look at next week, and you'll come to a really nice understanding of exactly what Solomon was trying to lay out for us. So, since Solomon reminds us, he says, keep this in mind. The teacher was wise. Let's look at Solomon's life. If somebody famous and wealthy writes a book right now in 2020, you will automatically know some things about that person. It was much the same way with Solomon. He writes the book of Ecclesiastes, and you note that there are not a lot of really intimate details. There's not a lot of personal stories. There's no miracles of God. There's nothing really truly bizarre in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a fairly simple, fairly straightforward rant, for lack of a better word. So for 11 plus chapters, he is just going on and on and on about all kinds of different things. With that said, it's interesting that he says that he studied Proverbs and he collected them. And then he worked on writing things down in a way that could be easily understood. Indicates to me that Solomon did write a lot of Proverbs, but he did a lot more of just collecting and organizing Proverbs for us to read. I usually tell people if they are getting into reading the Bible for the first time, start in the book of Proverbs, because Proverbs can be very much read and almost every one that you read, you're getting something. It's a piece of wisdom, it's a piece of knowledge. So Proverbs is absolutely incredible. Ecclesiastes usually isn't one of the first books you recommend that people read, and for the exact reason that there are so many things that seem dark or seem melancholy or seem depressing if you don't look at it correctly. Let's get into Solomon's life just a little bit. We know that his dad was King David, and David had an affair with Bathsheba. Their first child died. One of their later on children was Solomon. So interesting that Solomon came into this world as a result of not a very healthy relationship, at least from the onset. One thing we know Solomon for is his wisdom. I think it's very interesting that historically, even Jesus in the New Testament referenced the wisdom of Solomon. I think that's a strong feather in the cap for Solomon, not just proving his existence, because I don't think his existence necessarily needs to be proven, but as with anything in antiquity, there are people that would argue that Solomon's not even a real person. I fully believe Solomon was a real person, and obviously he wrote Ecclesiastes, he wrote Song of Solomon, he at least collected and wrote a lot of the Proverbs, and there was even some apocryphal literature, the Wisdom of Solomon, that's not in our collection of books that we call the Bible, but that was also attributed to Solomon in his writing. So I very much believe Solomon was a real person, and Solomon was also a wealthy person. I think this is important because wealth is often attributed with success, and as you look at some of the, I guess, dark themes in Ecclesiastes, you would assume that somebody that was as wealthy as Solomon would have been just so happy, so incredibly pleased with everything he did, everything that he accomplished, and that he would have found just such great joy in it that I would anticipate that the book of Ecclesiastes would have been this joyful rant about how awesome he was and about how awesome life is, but that's not what we read. Interesting stuff. Solomon was complicated on a relationship scale. You look at Solomon's relationships, we know that he had a first wife that he obviously was passionate about, but subsequently he married Pharaoh's daughters and women from other lands. They had different ways of worshiping. That didn't work out very well for Solomon. His life was so complicated with hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines that essentially things really kind of fell apart for him, and he kind of proved to himself that there is no joy in this lifestyle. In the book of Kings, it references Solomon having some sort of a relationship with the Queen of Sheba. Essentially, she would come in for his wisdom. She would bring him silver and gold and stuff like that. The biggest indicator for me here is that's just an awesome thing. That not only are you wise in ruling your area or your kingdom, so to speak, but you've got people from outside of your area coming to you for wisdom. That's pretty fantastic. In 1 Kings chapter 11 is where it actually records or chronicles God's disappointment in Solomon. So sometimes when you read Ecclesiastes by itself and you don't look at it historically, you assume that Solomon was wise, Solomon was great, everything here is perfectly fine. But God wasn't all that pleased with Solomon. It actually says this, 1 Kings chapter 11, and the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should go after no other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Imagine that. I think Solomon, in all of his wisdom, knew this even when he was writing the book of Ecclesiastes. So he knows that his life hasn't been awesome. He's an older guy. He's writing all of this stuff down for generations behind him because he knows truth. Now, this is incredibly important. King Solomon wealthy, powerful, wise, successful, experimental throughout his whole life, he has grasped something. He has figured something out. He not only has truth, but he has an inclination of at least what he should have done. And he feels bad about it. But he wants to communicate it like this. He wants to communicate it like, there's a life separated from God that is truly meaningless, and then there is a perspective under God, or a godly perspective that it's proper, it's right, it can be great, it can be something set apart, it can be something different. Which life do you want to experience? I'm going to close our conclusion part 1 with verse 11. The teacher, Koheleth, Solomon, says this: "The words of the wise are like cattle prods, painful but helpful. Their collected sayings are like a nail-studded stick with which a shepherd drives the sheep." Ouch. I don't necessarily want to get hit with a nail-studded stick. Most people don't approach life or their next decision like this. They're like, hey, I just want to ruin everything. I want to mess this up so bad that I can learn something from it. That's not the way we do it. We assume that our next decisions are going to be the right decisions, and sometimes in our selfishness and in our pride, we just kind of plow ahead with no regard for wise counsel, no regard for what God actually wants. And a lot of times we want what we want, and we want a little side dish of God, and we plow into life, and then we find out later it doesn't work that way. Do we do that intentionally? I don't think so. I mean, you can ask any 20-year-old or any 30-year-old that's in the middle of a train wreck in their life, and they would never say, I set out to wreck this train. I really wanted to mess this up bad. It's not the way it works. That's why verse 11 is such a powerful verse. The words of the wise are like cattle prods, painful but helpful. Of course, I'm reading in the NLT because I think it's very understandable. In the NIV, it uses the word goads. It says, the words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. When you read it that way, it doesn't necessarily make as much sense because we don't really know what a goad is. I want to ask you one question. Do you want just a comfortable life? Or are you fine being prodded through life by a shepherd that wants the best thing for you? It's a simple and a hard question at the same time. Do you want a comfortable life? And sometimes a comfortable life doesn't have all that much meaning. Or do you want a life that's guided by a good shepherd that wants to maybe push you further, maybe lead you somewhere better, maybe give you more influence, maybe just keep you away from danger, keep you away from the train wreck, keep you away from the bad things in life? Which life are you pursuing? We're getting close to the conclusion. Next week, we are going to close the lid on the book of Ecclesiastes. In most Bibles, the subheading for the end of Ecclesiastes simply says, the conclusion of the matter. We'll get there next week. But I would encourage you to go into the book of 1 Kings and chapter 10, chapter 11, and read about Solomon. Reread the first 11 chapters Look at these verses and think about a perspective devoid of God and a perspective with God in the picture. Think about your life. Think about your direction. Think about who's directing it. Do you think you're in charge? Or are you submitting your will to something greater? We'll conclude this next week, and when I say I'm looking forward to it, I am like looking forward to it. I cannot wait. It's going to be great.